Is he going to kill me? For the first time in a long time, Elizabeth Wilson felt she had something to look forward to as she drove home from her sister's house one late November evening. She was returning from an annual tradition for the Wilson family, dinner following the last hockey game before Christmas. It had felt so good to be where she was so accepted and could just be herself. She had 4 days off from her job as an office manager. Most of all, she felt relieved not to have encountered her estranged husband, Mark. She realized that Mark was likely aware of her whereabouts that evening because he'd seemed to make it his business to know where she was at all times since she'd filed for divorce in September. This was their first Christmas apart after 4 years of marriage, and she guessed that he might be ruminating about this, and probably drinking too, this being a Thursday night. It was now nearly midnight, and she was almost home free. Maybe he'd been too drunk or high to remember her annual family tradition. It was somewhat a relief to know that he was without a car. Just a month earlier, he'd tried to force her car off the road when she had been on her way home after an evening out with friends. She found out later that Mark had been waiting and watching for her outside her friend's house, though she didn't know how he'd known she was there. It could have been a lucky guess, or he might have tailed her after she'd left work. Elizabeth had obtained a restraining order after Mark had repeatedly shown up at her work to try to talk to her, or just to scream at her. He'd told her that he'd ruin everything for her. The last time she'd seen him, she had been frightened to see how his appearance had deteriorated. He'd lost weight, and his color was pale. He'd grown a beard, and his hair was long and unkempt. She'd heard from a friend that Mark was smoking crack, something he'd never done while they were living together. She'd also heard that he'd stopped showing up for his job as a mechanic and had been fired. She also knew that he had cashed out his retirement account. It frightened her to see him going downhill so fast, and she was worried for her safety, especially after he'd started making threats to kill himself. Elizabeth was less than a mile home when a white car pulled up to hers along a suburban stretch of highway. Almost instantaneously, she recognized the other driver to be Mark. Just as she'd imagined in so many bad dreams, he was pointing a gun out his window and motioning for her to pull over. She sped up just as he fired, and 2 bullets struck the rear driver's side window just behind her head. Seconds later, he again pulled up to her car and fired 2 more shots. Both bullets hit her driver's side door this time. In a blind terror, Elizabeth headed toward the police station that was less than a mile away. Tailing her closely, Mark fired 3 more shots into her car, missing each time. Not deterred when Elizabeth pulled into the police station lot, Mark pulled alongside her car, pointed his gun, and pulled the trigger. The gun jammed, and he sped off into the night. Mark was later arrested at his home and held without bail. He was ultimately convicted of assault with intent to commit homicide, illegal possession of a firearm, and violation of a restraining order, for which he received a prison sentence of 8 years.